Thank you, everyone, for coming out on a football weekend to an academic talk. You're very brave, and I applaud you for that. But what I'm going to talk about today is an international social science research project that is going on at Notre Dame and at other universities around the world. And it's about something that sounds kind of strange, which is measuring democracy, but I'll talk about that, and I think it will make sense after we get started. The reason we're doing this is that in the last few decades, Western governments have been spending a lot of money, billions of dollars, to promote democracy and good governance all around the world. And all of these people who are promoting democracy have a big problem. That is, they don't know whether these programs actually have an impact or not. They don't know whether they have an impact. They don't know whether the programs actually might be making things worse. And so they need some standards for judging what it means for a country to be more democratic or less democratic, which in essence means they need to be able to measure democracy. And the democracy indicators that the world has right now are not really up to the task of doing these things well enough. People have been producing democracy ratings for a long time. And one thing that we've learned is that it's actually not that hard to say that this country's democratic and that one is not. We know that Switzerland is and North Korea is not. But there's some harder judgments to make that existing indicators can't make. It's difficult to say that Switzerland is more democratic than the United States. It's hard to say whether Russia is less democratic this year than it was last year. It's hard to say whether Venezuela is more democratic in some respects than it was, and less democratic in some other respects. And so we're trying to produce some indicators that would be useful for these purposes. And in this, our needs as researchers have converged with the needs of development agencies and international organizations that need to assess the impact of their programs they're spending so much money on. Now, when you try to measure democracy, you immediately run into two problems. The first is a concept problem. That is, that people disagree about what democracy is. And this is inevitable because democracy is something that people have been talking about and writing about for 2,500 years from a lot of different perspectives. And what democracy means is a product of all these different threads of scholarship. The other problem is a knowledge problem. It's a problem that nobody in the world has enough expertise about all the countries in the world and their history to be able to rate them all well on the same metric. And so democracy ratings usually have to limit their geographic scope or their historical scope or the expertise that they draw on when they're producing measures. So I'm part of a team called Varieties of Democracy, or V-Dem, that is trying to resolve these problems. This is a global team. It has two institutional homes, one at the Department of Political Science at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, and the other at the Kellogg Institute at the University of Notre Dame. And Paolo Carrozza, who just walked in, is the director of the Kellogg Institute. Would you like to say something, Paolo?
Well, sorry to interrupt what you say, so I'll say just two sentences. Say, welcome, delighted to have you here. The luncheon that ran over, which is why I was a few minutes late. I'm hoping that some of the people there will come and join us as well. I'm happy just to say we're really proud and delighted to have Michael and the V-Dem project have one of their institutional homes at Notre Dame and at the Kellogg Institute. The world is changing, democracy is changing, and the Kellogg Institute's expertise in democracy has to adapt to that need too, and Michael's at the center of that effort for us. One of our stars, and I think you'll find his work really exciting.
Thanks, Paolo. Okay, so I was saying this is an international team. There are two Swedish leaders of the team, Jan Tyrell and Staffan Lindberg, and two U.S. leaders, John Gehring at Boston University and me. And our solution to the concept problem is to measure just about everything that democracy means to different people around the world. So at present, we're dealing with 5 different versions of democracy. There's a core of electoral democracy, which is about competition to select leaders in free and fair elections. You can't have democracy without elections, at least the way we think about it. But at the same time, there's more to democracy than just elections. And so these other four types of democracy are ones that kind of fill in the gaps and add to democracy things that could be missing. So for example, liberal democracy. There's a danger that if you just have electoral democracy, then an elected leader could become a tyrant in between elections. And so liberal democracy installs constitutional guarantees and protections for individual liberties to make sure that that doesn't happen. Participatory democracy addresses the critique that people need opportunities to participate more than just casting one vote every 4 years. And so there should be other opportunities like party primaries and public hearings and things like that that enhance participation and make people better citizens. Deliberative democracy says that leaders have to be able to provide reasonable justifications for the policies that they adopt and can't just kind of cheat their way or lie their way into public office. And egalitarian democracy says that elections can never be really free and fair unless all citizens have the minimal basic physical and mental capacities to take part as free and equal citizens. And so we're trying to address all of those different aspects of democracy, and that's why it's called Varieties of Democracy. Now, in order to measure these big ideas, we turn to a larger team that has expertise in every type of democratic institution. And so they translated the core ideas into the components of those core ideas, and then to the subcomponents of the components, and then the subcomponents of the components. And so we end up with hundreds of different attributes or aspects of democracy that we are trying to measure. And they include everything you'd want to know about elections, of course, but they also include information about gender and ethnic equality, social movements, the rule of law, direct democracy, corruption, federalism, quality of discourse. There's really something for everybody who's interested in democracy, and we let people decide what they think are the relevant qualities that a democracy should have, and they can use whatever measures we provide about those things. Now, we also have a solution to the knowledge problem thanks to millions of dollars of support from many sources, starting with the Kellogg Institute, but including especially Scandinavian governments and the European Commission, and now recently the National Science Foundation. And we've developed online surveys to reach out to several thousand experts all around the world. This is an actual plot of visitors to our site. And these are people who really have a lot of expertise about democracy in their countries. 90% of them have a doctoral or master's degree, but most importantly, the typical expert has lived in country for nearly 30 years. So to a great extent, each country is rated by its own experts. So this is the big data project about democracy. At this point, our database contains more than 13 million data points. And with most big data projects, you find that the only way to really grasp what is in this data set is to use some visual tools to explore it. And so we have developed a series of online graphs and other kinds of tools that enable people to access our data and tour it and see what has evolved. At present, the website has data on several hundred variables, several hundred different aspects of democracy for 87 countries for every year from 1900 to 2012. And we're expanding this all the time. I think the whole world will be online sometime next year. And I'm going to show you what we can do with this online tool. I'm going to give you an example with Venezuela. And then two of our graduate students in political science at Notre Dame, Sandra Botero and Tahir Close, are going to give other examples about other countries that they know very well. And then we're going to open it up. We have some screens around the room, so we're going to divide this into small groups, and you can interactively explore the live database online in the second half of this session. So you can, whatever questions you have about democracy in any of these countries, we can help you answer. Okay, so here's a typical graph of just one variable. This is an index of participatory democracy for Venezuela from 1900 to 2012. And there are a couple of things I'd like you to note about this. First off, usually on these graphs, the higher values represent more democracy, the more democratic values, and the lower values are less democratic. Like if it's below this threshold, it's in the range of the lowest value you can get. Above this threshold is in the range of the higher value you can get. And also you notice that there's kind of a shadow behind the line, and that shadow is a confidence interval. It represents the degree of uncertainty that we have about the correct score. So the wider that band is, the less certain we are about where the true score is, and the narrower it is, the more confident we are that we really have got it right. With this tool, you can zoom in. You can just select a range of years and focus on that. So here I'm focusing on 1957 to 2012. And I've marked a key point in the history of democracy in Venezuela. Many of you have heard of Hugo Chavez, who was president of Venezuela until he died last year. And you can see that participatory democracy had an increase in 1989 when they started directly electing governors and mayors. And then participatory democracy at least declined after that point. I would also like, but one other thing we can do with these charts is if you click on the line, it spreads out into the components of the line. So you would naturally want to ask, how do you measure participatory democracy? Well, you can click on that line, and at the first level, you can see, well, it's composed of electoral democracy, which is fundamental to all of our different varieties of democracy. And it also has a participation component. And so these two things diverge. Actually, we see that under Chavez, participatory democracy, the participation part improved a bit, but the electoral democracy part got worse after that point. So that went down. But why did electoral democracy go down? Well, we can drill down once again. If we click on the electoral democracy line, we can see some of the components of that. Here are two components that I've highlighted, and this is a nice little trick we have with this. All of the components of electoral democracy would show up here by default. So suffrage, clean elections, having an elected executive, and freedom of association. But I have toggled off the variables that I don't want you to see for the time being, so we can focus on just the ones, just a couple of the first, in the first instance. So we can see that before and after Chavez, these two variables didn't change at all. They still had full suffrage. They still had an elected president. So that didn't change. What did change? Well, two things. Freedom of association, the blue line, declined a bit during this period, but the biggest change was in the clean elections variables. And so you might ask, what does clean elections measure? And here are 8 variables. I'm drilling down on that once again. We're kind of going to levels and lower levels of measurement. And so there were voting irregularities, government intimidation, electoral violence, vote buying, free and fair elections, and characteristics of the electoral management body, sort of like the Federal Elections Commission or the national body that manages elections, and voter registry. And here I'm highlighting just 3 of these things, which tell a story about what was going on. And they kind of go in different directions because not all aspects of democracy go together. So this line is telling us that the capacity of the state to manage elections actually improved during this period. Improved a little bit, but significantly. They became better able to manage elections, but at the same time, the green line shows us that the government was increasingly intimidating voters. That is, assaulting people or harassing them as they were going to the polling places to discourage people from the opposition from voting against the government. And at the same time, the electoral management body became less autonomous. That is, it was less free to just follow the law and increasingly under pressure to manage the election in a way that would favor the government. So we can see several different trends that move in different directions and tell a more complete story about what was going on in Venezuela during this time. So now I'm going to hand things over to Sandra, who's going to talk about Colombia.
Thank you for being here. It's really a treat for me to share today with you some of what makes this project so special and what it can tell us about the nature of democracy in Colombia and in other countries in the world. So when I tell people I'm from Colombia, usually 4 things come up. First, coffee. Second, drugs. Third, violence or guerrillas. Or fourth, Shakira, the singer. So this happens to me over cocktails, at conferences, It happens to me when I'm doing my research, when I'm doing interviews. And true, my country is these things, and these things are very much a part of democracy in Colombia. Shakira perhaps less, but the others are certainly fundamental. Yet my country is so much more. So the type of data and the information that we are helping produce through V-Dem allows us to get a more nuanced picture. So I'd like to tell you a bit about Colombia and Colombian democracy through V-Dem data. A good place to start is the Index of Electoral Democracy that Michael mentioned earlier. This index is the sum of many different and smaller indicators that together give us a general sense of the extent to which the ideal of electoral democracy is achieved in a particular country. If we look at the evolution of democracy in Colombia throughout the 20th century, we can see a steady improvement, right? Except for these years in the 40s that I will mention that I will mention a little bit ahead, we see that things have been improving. For people who study Latin American politics or who know anything about Latin America, sort of this fact about Colombia, that violence coincides with a very long-lived and largely stable democracy, is often surprising. It's a contradiction that is hard to wrap your head around. But that's also what makes it so fascinating. For example, in striking contrast to other countries in the region that around the 70s or the 80s were undergoing military dictatorships, Colombia had none of that. Except for a very brief sort of military interlude that we will talk about later, none of that was happening in Colombia. And we can drill down into what this electoral democracy index means by looking at some of its subcomponents. And here we're looking at 1950-2010. This graph shows us some of the subcomponents, and we can start with the blue line, which looks at suffrage. And the blue line, if you see, dramatically increases here, and it coincides and it shows the extension of suffrage to women in Colombia. The red line, which measures whether the president was elected, only drops dramatically here, when again, this was a very brief military dictatorship during 3 years, General Rojas, and we see that this is perfectly captured by the V-Dem indicators. Another thing that the index includes is clean elections, and this is this blue line here that dips in the 70s when there was massive electoral fraud. General Rojas tried to make his way to the presidency through legal means and was robbed of the opportunity by the opposing candidate. And this is something also that the data captures. The next slide takes us back to the Index of Electoral Democracy, the blue one. Again, we see a steady improvement, but this time I have also included an indicator for high court independence. So this indicator graphs the ability of the court to function as a check on the executive. This is the highest court in Colombia, equivalent to the Supreme Court in the US. So I do research on courts, so it's always interesting to talk about courts, but they're also fundamental to the functioning of any of any democracy anywhere. So again, in a country that is mostly associated with violence, we see an instability, we see a court that is very, very independent. When I talk to this with experts and people have a hard time wrapping their head around the idea that this is the case, that the Colombian court would be so independent and so active. Well, actually, if you compare it with other Latin American high courts, it's the most independent. So this graph, there's a lot going on, but let me walk you through it, graphs the trajectory of the highest courts in Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Colombia, and Venezuela from 1950. So here's the Colombian court, which compared to the others is clearly the most independent one in recent years. And there's all sorts of interesting things going on here too. We can see the decline of independence in the Venezuelan court during the Chavez years. We can also see improvements in the Argentinian one, and we can see sort of the steady and relatively lower performance of the other two courts. So when I'm doing interviews and when I'm talking to people, I wish that I could carry a little copy of this in my pocket and show it to people to sort of, so that they could see what I mean when I talk about high court independence. So we talk up here about two institutional aspects of democracy, elections and checks on the government. Both of these things seem to be doing well, but these are also the things that coexist with these other aspects of Colombia that are sadly more familiar to people, guerrillas and violence, for example. So here again, we go back to the index of electoral democracy, but this time I have also graphed the indicator that V-Dem has for anti-system movements, so revolutionary or guerrilla organizations, of which Colombia has plenty. This indicator is particularly sensitive, and it's interesting that it captures both in the 40s, the birth of all the peasant guerrillas in Colombia, and what later were decades of a lot of conflict and violence. And in 1964, you also see the spike, which marks the birth of the FARC, the oldest guerrilla movement, which is still active in the continent. And most interestingly, too, and most auspiciously, the indicator, this drop here, so this drop in the number of presence of anti-system movements signal also how things have begun to get better in the last decade in Colombia. So that's sort of on a more positive note. What are the consequences of the presence of this violence and the presence of this and other groups in Colombia, and how elections happen, and how elections are held, what happens in the ground? So here again, just for sort of reference purposes, the Electoral Democracy Index in blue, and now two other indicators. One that shows us voting irregularities, and another one, the green one, that shows us instances of vote buying. So was there evidence of intentional irregularities by political actor, or was there evidence of vote buying? And in this case, in contrast to what we have seen before, lower values suggest more vote buying or more voting irregularities, that people are forced or encouraged through gifts or other types of things to vote one way or the other, which is sadly very common in Colombia, given a lot of the problems with violence and political actors that we have. So this has been a brief tour de force of democracy in Colombia. It's a treat. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be here with you in Indianapolis and share some of the findings of Varieties of Democracy project. In this part of the presentation, I changed the regional focus from Latin America to North Africa and look at Algeria. So, as you know, in the last couple of years in the Middle East, several Arab countries like Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, and Libya, they had some uprising or revolutions which are in general called the Arab Spring. But I ask you, have you ever heard the name of Algeria in the news about Arab Spring? I believe not, because except a couple of small-scale protests, Algeria was not one of the Arab Spring cases. So the question is, whereas Algeria had a very strong history of protests and social movements, why wasn't it one of the countries of the Arab Spring? I'll try to answer this question by the help of V-Dem data. I start with electoral democracy, just like Sandra did before me. The party that gave the independence to Algeria from France in 1962, the FLN, they established a one-party regime and they ruled country for around 25, 30 years. And although there were some elections at that time, since these elections were not competitive, the electoral democracy score of Algeria was extremely low. So it was an authoritarian regime at that time. And here, in 1989, we see an increase in the electoral democracy score of Algeria. Because that year, the president of the time amended the constitution and opened the system up to the opposition parties. And in 1991, Algeria had its first competitive general elections. And that was the time the Algerian democracy or Algerian regime in terms of democracy reached to peak. But what happened there? The Islamist party, FIS, won a landslide victory in the first round of the elections over the state party, FLN. And following to that, the army intervened and canceled the elections because they were afraid that the Islamist party would change the Algerian regime into an Islamic regime after the electoral victory. And this coup d'etat in 1992 which started this decline in the electoral democracy score, it launched an 8-year-long civil war in Algeria between the army and the armed forces connected to FIS, the Islamist groups. And although there is some recovery after that, Algeria couldn't reach to the levels of democracy that they were expecting when the transition started. Now let's look at some of the components of electoral democracy. This red line shows the multi-party elections in Algeria. As you can see, after transition to multi-party system in 1989, there's a huge increase in the multi-party election score. And even today, although Algeria is not a democratic regime, there are still multi-party elections, and they're taking place regularly. That's why it has a very high score. But not everything is so bright in terms of democracy in Algeria. Here, this blue line is voting irregularities in the elections. So you can think that while the electoral democracy score increases in early 90s, you expect that voting irregularities decrease, right? So voting irregularities decrease and voting irregularities score should increase. But we see a contrasting result. Why? Think like this. When there was just one party and one party rule, would the state party need to rig the elections? Of course not, because they already win the elections. But after the state system was open to opposition parties, when the elections started to become competitive, the state party started to use some voting irregularities, and they did some fraud. That's why the voting irregularity score decreased in Algeria. Now here I move on to another index of varieties of democracy, which is party institutionalization. So what is party institutionalization? A party system is institutionalized when the parties have strong organizations, they have strong linkages in the society, and electorate are valuing them, and we don't see much electoral volatility between different elections. So in the United States, we have a strong party system since more than 150 years. So this is taken for granted. This is an institutionalized regime. But not in every case we see such party systems. In other countries, we see 15 parties in one election and 2 parties in the next election and 20 parties in the election after that. So there are not institutionalized party systems. But institutionalized party systems are very important for democratization. And that's why we're focusing that in this point. And this graph is quite interesting. This blue line shows the national party control, and purple line shows party institutionalization score. When there was one party regime in Algeria, obviously national party control was extremely high. And their party was not strong in the society, and they didn't work well with the civil society organizations. That's why party institutionalization score was extremely low. Once the transition to multi-party system started, national party control decreased, and party institutionalization score increased because the new parties had strong party organizations and had strong linkages to the society. So not just a party system was established, they developed a very strong party system by the early 90s. And this green line shows the party ban, and lower score means the state is more inclined to ban the parties. And here, while the opposition parties were illegal, the party ban score was extremely low. And it increased, but still you can see some decline at this point. That point is when the coup d'etat took place in Algeria in 1992, and the time that the army banned the Islamist party FIS. But still you can see a stability after that. But although Algeria has a strong institutionalized party system, that doesn't mean that they present a strong opposition to the regime. This red line is opposition party autonomy, and as you can see, it is pretty low. What does it mean? This means the parties, the opposition parties, although there are several of them, the opposition parties are co-opted by the government, and they cannot present a strong opposition to the existing regime. So what do we understand from all these graphs? Going back to the electoral democracy index indicator. So as you see, first we have a one-party system and authoritarian regime in Algeria. Then we see some sort of democratization starting from 89, and then coup d'etat comes in 1992 and a decline in the democratization score. There's some recovery, but still we can say that Algeria doesn't have a democratic regime since they cannot fulfill the basic criteria of democracy, which is free and fair elections in a competitive environment. So what about Arab Spring? This green arrow shows when the Arab Spring took place in the region. And as you can see, there is no change in the Algerian score. But in other cases, there's change at that point. But also you can notice that that change in Algeria took place almost 20 years before their neighbors. And actually, that democratization attempt ended in a very tragic way. First, the military took over, and then it started a civil war and claimed the lives of more than 100,000 people. So because of that, the democratization attempt has a memory of violence and repression in Algerian citizens. Because of this vivid memory, the Algerian citizens, during the 2010 and onwards, they opted for this democratically lacking government, and they chose stability over uprising. That's why they didn't start an uprising as in other countries. Thank you very much.
I think I can go without the mic. Okay, I'll keep it. Thank you, Sandra and Tahir. That was a great job. But I wanted to say that this was just a small taste of all the information that's already in our database. You've looked at 3 countries and just a few variables, but we've got, at this point, already publicly online, 87 countries and hundreds of variables over more than a century of history. It's just a vast amount of information. It would take us a week to go through it all, and it would just be overwhelming. And we'll have the entire world up next year. So descriptively, you can imagine how valuable this would be, for example, for teachers, for students who are writing term papers, but also for journalists who are trying to get a quick overview of the political history of a country. It could also be useful for our funders. This is why they're funding it, because it's a great tool for evaluating the impact of their many programs to try to promote specific aspects of democracy and governance in other countries. But beyond the descriptive function, this kind of information is essential for finally getting to the bottom of the question of what the causes and consequences of democracy are. There are a lot of ideas floating around about why democracy matters. Does it promote economic growth? Does it promote well-being in other ways? Does it promote peace and stability, manage conflict, create greater legitimacy for governments? There are a lot of debates about the causes of democracy as well. Do you promote democracy best by helping the economy grow, or by making strong political parties, or creating judicial independence, or giving legislators offices, or things like that? We don't really know the answers to those questions, but we can begin to answer those questions when we have hard data like this that we can use to test these propositions. And so we're hoping that this project will really transform the world's understanding of democracy and its causes and consequences. So I guess if anybody has some quick questions, we could do that, but otherwise we'll break into small groups and you can explore the data yourselves with us as your guides to help you get acquainted with the database. Sure.
So I understand how you can use this data to understand history better, and how you could also use it to measure a change that you affect to see if it then affects the quality of democracy. Have you found at all that it helps you predict the trajectory forward of a country? I mean, it's hard to say that since this is new data, you don't know what's going to happen in 5 years, but do you anticipate that you could generalize that you know, certain countries are likely to go a certain way, or is it really very much dependent on actions the government takes or other historical moments in time?
Well, we haven't answered that question yet, but it's among the questions that we want to answer with the data. We're planning, I'm not sure I'm entirely behind this, but we're planning to do some data mining to see if there are predictors of democratic change. I mean, whether they're causal or not, sometimes there are things that are kind of bellwethers of a situation that's likely to change, and it's possible to discover those things and gradually find out whether they really are causes or not. So that's something that we hope to look into. And certainly, with this vast database, this was if somebody wants to do that, this is the only place they could go to do that. Anyone else? Okay, so Sandra will be in one corner, Tahir in another corner, and I'll be up here at the front. And if there's a country you're interested in, and it's among the 87 we have public right now, then you can come up and you can ask anything you want to know about democracy in that country, and we can tell you what our data is saying about it.